Hello and welcome to the MaML podcast. I'm your host, David Wu, and in today's episode, I interview Akilesh Bapu, who is co-founder and CEO of DeepScribe, an AI-powered medical scribe that can listen to a patient's visit, write a clinical note, and then seamlessly inject it into the EHR. They're a pretty incredible company working on a very important task, especially in light of the ongoing burnout epidemic plaguing medicine. In addition to all this, Akilesh is a very cool guy, humble and fun to talk to. I hope you all enjoy this interview as much as I did. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter at the MaML Podcast. So glad to have you on our show today. Akilesh, I was wondering if you could tell us about your path and how you came to the intersection of medicine and machine learning.
Absolutely, David. Thanks for having me on the show. I'm excited to dig in, but I'll start with my background and then maybe I can go into the story of how DeepScribe kind of fell in my lap, and then potentially talk a little bit more about the company, what we're doing, maybe our goals, if that sounds great.
Yeah.
Awesome. So personally, on my end, I'm pretty early on in my career, so I don't have, a 20-year CV, but I went to Cal and spent the first couple years really in love with, front-end products. And my dream was to join a company like Apple or Google and really work on front-end experiences. And that's how I spent a good amount of my work experience. And then I kind of saw this opportunity, which came up over and over again, of voice and computer interaction, where in order to really kind of feel the next level of, I would say, intelligence, you would have to figure out a good way to bridge, or for computers to really understand the complexity of natural language. So that's kind of what pulled me into the Berkeley research environment. And when I was there, I was basically devoting most of my time to pushing forward the boundaries of summarization. And summarization, if you're not too familiar with the space, involves taking some sort of unstructured text. It could be a CNN article, it could be a PubMed article, but essentially you have all this information and you're trying to compress it into something that's short, understandable. And there are a lot of use cases that spur from that. From a court setting, you're looking at just taking notes. From a business setting, you want to see like what action items you come from your meeting. In my specific case, we were looking at how to establish this sense of control, because a lot of the deeper models do great, but then you sort of lose control over the type of information that you end up with. So we were figuring out how to augment these larger models with smaller models and kind of basically define what we want the models to summarize. So we had a breakthrough we made there, which was really exciting. And then we used that. So the story of DeepScribe actually starts when I had these research findings and I was really excited about them. And I actually went back and showed my parents, because that's the first thing you do as a kid in school. And so I was showing my dad the demo of what we had built. My dad, by the way, is an oncologist. And the backstory there is that I actually, as a kid, didn't experience this problem firsthand, but basically saw secondhand the perfect lifestyle for my dad, which was one in which there was no EHR. He was writing down notes, just scribbling them down, spending most of his time with his patients, very less time in front of the computer, to after he adopted an EHR system, it just completely changed on him. All of a sudden, he had to document everything. It was 3 hours in his day that he had to just stack on top of everything he was already doing. And that bled into the evenings, that bled into the weekends. So as a kid, I kind of just saw this thing that was incomprehensible, where my dad all of a sudden wasn't able to come to my soccer practice, for example, or just, the time was very limited. So it was this problem in the back of my head. I tried as a kid to, get him on Dragon Dictation and some of the state of the art back then, but none of it really worked. Fast forward about
Wait, as a kid, you
later.
tried to get him onto Dragon?
As a kid, I Googled around and found
Wow.
software for him to download and use. And I mean, bottom line, nothing worked for him. So back when I went
That's impressive.
yeah,
That
I
you
mean,
took the initiative.
the power of search, right? And so in college, I was showing my dad the summarization tool, and one thing that kind of just was bizarre to me was he started typing in a patient-physician conversation instead of a PubMed
Oh,
article, which he was supposed to be doing as part of the demo. And he said this one powerful thing, which was, if you can even get 20% of my node right, it's probably going to save me an hour a day. So that's why I'm doing
wow.
this. And that sort of blew my mind, because on one hand, I knew the problem existed back then, but you kind of do this thing where you just assume that the problems of a decade in the past kind of just get solved by someone. And that's what I assumed about medical documentation. And it's
They get
also not
solved by
talked
you.
about. Now it is, yeah.
Yeah.
Back with medical documentation, it's just something that never comes up in the headlines, at least back at the time when we were founding DeepScribe. And so we, launched an experiment, did a lot of research with both family, friends, colleagues, and figured out, what the problem was here, and why physicians were still spending so much time on documentation. And we found out, a couple big things. One was that it was still very widespread. I mean, you have certain clinicians that have full control of their workflows and are tech savvy and can figure out a way to get it done. But then you have most of physicians that still have to rely on two tools. They either can use dictation, speech to text, and save the burden of typing, or they can adopt a human scribe or a virtual scribe that just comes in and follows them around, writes their notes for them. But what was crazy is that human scribes, even though they've been around for a while, have less than 10% adoption, which means that most physicians are still spending a lot of time on documentation. And if you really dig, you can see articles that talk about physician burnout and how they spend 42% of their day on documentation. People have collected stats around this stuff, but there is no good solution. What we also saw that was interesting was that pretty much every big company, as well as a ton of VC-backed startups, had tried to build a product to solve documentation. So you
Wow.
have, Google that had a scribe that they worked with Stanford on. You have Microsoft with EmpowerMD. So you would surely think that this problem was solved, but I think one big opportunity we saw was that no one was really truly applying the state of the art in tech to this problem. State of the art in meaning these big deep learning models, along with just the cutting edge in NLP, collecting, structuring, and labeling the data, thinking of the problem as an ML problem, like a
Mm.
tech company would, and bring that solution. I think a lot of folks either had a non-technical background or had a background from healthcare, and so we're kind of building things in between that didn't really work. So we saw that opportunity, and that's kind of what fueled DeepScribe. So at the core, we wanted to build a product in which we could have, with the magical press of a button, doctor record their conversation with the patient, and then in a few minutes, the note would be generated, put into their EHR, so that they could not just save a little bit of time on documentation, but take the entire documentation burden out of the process. And in doing so, you're a med student, so you probably already can predict like the value adds of this. But they can either see more patients, they can spend more time with the patients they have. They're probably thinking more about the patient's history and their clock cycles in their brain, are thinking more about that than documentation. But the thing that was most meaningful to me was just the work-life balance and the ability for a clinician to spend that time with family, spend that time on themselves, and just regain the balance that they had before EHRs. So yeah, that's kind of how I got hitched on the DeepScribe, and so far it's been great. I know I've been talking a lot, so I'll just say this last thing and stop there.
No,
But
please, you're the
we've
guest.
so we launched the product officially in 2020, and since then we basically grew from like 0 customers to becoming a market leader, or on par with other market leaders in clinical documentation, just in terms of number of clinicians we have on the platform. That's what really helped us raise this past Series A. And the big validation piece we got was that we were able to take this research that is in the cutting edge and was previously only proven in a research environment, but bringing it into healthcare, and making it work in an industry with such a high bar for accuracy. So that's kind of a little bit about DeepScribe. We're close to about 1 million patients that we've seen so far on the
A
platform,
million.
and
Wow.
yeah, so we made our mark so far, and excited to continue growing. The team's almost 60 people now. It's kind of
Wow.
crazy how time flies, but yeah, I'll stop there, and happy to dive into any part of the journey
Yeah.
or talk about any other topic that may be of interest.
Oh, so many questions. I got so many questions that I want to ask. Um, where should we begin? I'm curious, what what specialties are you guys used in? Is it all of them or certain ones like emergency medicine, oncology?
Yeah, the way we structured our notes is one in which we only care about the information that gets retained from the conversation. So if you dig into like pretty much every medical note, there are very like key things that you want in that note. And then for every specialty, the same key things are there, but maybe the frame of reference is different. So in an oncology patient, you're talking about their cancer progression, whether they had chemotherapy or not, their reactions from that. The primary care patient, you're probably talking about something different, but that information is there. So we train our models to retain that information. And then we have ways in which we can customize that according to specialties. So the problem becomes more of a how do we build customizations for specialties than to train
Mm-hmm.
specific models for different specialties. So
Yeah.
right now, out of the box, we're able to support pretty much every specialty, but there are some customizations that we have to build in order to really, truly own a specialty. So right now, like our biggest user is primary care physicians,
Mm.
but also we get a lot of love from psych docs, orthopedic docs, gastro, cardio, and a couple others.
Wow, I would love to demo this because to give some context, before starting medical school, I was actually a medical scribe,
Nice.
and we used to. I was actually at my hospital. They transitioned from paper charts to EHR while I was there. So
Oh
for a
no,
period
I'm
of time, I
sorry.
was actually like writing the paper charts, which is actually kind of cool. Like back in the day, they had just like you would circle a little, they had a little
Hmm.
pre-made sheet for like different kinds of conditions, and you would circle things like, oh, for like chest pain, oh, did they have this or this, and then you kind of circle it and cross things out. um and then now, as a med student, I feel like on clinical rotations you're kind of a scribe. Like you see
Yeah.
the patient with the doc, and then you kind of just fill in the note. And I would love to see how DeepScribe um summarizes these notes, because I do feel like uh, some parts it is pretty simple, but like I'm curious, how do you know like what's salient, or kind of can you kind of share a little bit about the secret sauce of how do you summarize and find like the important features? Yeah.
Yeah, of course. And I think the topic you brought up is a pretty interesting one because we focus entirely on clinicians that are practicing, but there's this whole other demographic, such as residents or med students on rotations that have to write notes. And it could be interesting for us as a long-term investment to kind of bring that state-of-the-art in tech to the learning process. But in terms of how the tech works, and identifies what's salient and not salient. I think the short answer is that the way we've broken down the notes allows us to essentially train these larger models on it. And you can think of it very similar to a self-driving system where it's not one model doing the entire summarization. You have multiple models working together
Mm.
to generate a result. And so one is, an entity extractor, another one could be a classifier,
Ah.
and you have other types of models that are doing the same task, but we kind of merge them together and get a result that is robust and makes sense. But the answer to the salient versus non-salient is we've seen close to 1 million patients. We have so many different examples of areas that are salient and non-salient. So our models have learned pretty well what makes a medical concept and what isn't at this point.
Mm. Do you guys train in like a specific model for each provider, or you know what I mean? Because like different providers have like different ways of
Yeah.
interviewing.
Yeah, so we try to stay away from that as much as possible, because I think that would require a lot of data, but also we would have a subpar product for each provider. So our solution to
Uh,
that was, we get the general information, and we have an ontology that can be shared across multiple physicians, and then there's a customization layer that can kind of convert things based off how a physician likes. So if a certain physician wants their general section of the physical exam to start with well appearing, and then another physician wants something that says doing well, they still map to the same like concept in our backend. So we train a model to support all of that, but then on the front end we can reorganize or substitute out words, and make the notes look pretty catered to
mm.
what the clinician wants. So that's how we've been able to just really fast scale up specialties, because if you have to train a model for each one, it would uh, take a lot of time and effort.
Yeah. I was wondering if you could walk me through like an example of from start to finish using DeepScribe. Like say doc walks in, starts the patient
Yeah.
encounter, like Does he have to push a button? Is there a special
Hmm.
button on the EHR that he has to press? Um,
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So in the very beginning, we were all about. I mean, we were researchers, and we wanted the best in audio. So we actually had and what we called an Alexa knockoff. So it was an 8 microphone array. It was a hardware device that we made in house, and it would just sit in the clinician's office in the corner. Each office would have a device, and they would go into their EHR. We would present a start stop button to them inside the EHR, and they would just click it, and it would start recording. So that was workflow V1. But with COVID and just the sudden demand that we had, it was almost impossible to ship devices to each clinician and set it up. So we actually just figured out how to support the same fidelity of audio on an iPhone or any device within the Apple ecosystem. So iPhone, iPad, Apple Watch, and that's basically what they use today. So the clinician, uh, there's some backend magic that happens before the workflow even starts, but from a clinician's perspective, they have a list of patients on their phone, iPad, or Apple Watch. They hit the patient, they hit the start recording button, and then just put it down and then talk face to face with the patient. And when they're done, they would hit the stop button. We allow clinicians to put in pre and post recordings if they'd like. So a lot of clinicians enjoy just doing a mind dump into their notes, and
uh,
a lot of that doesn't happen in the conversation, right? So
yeah, yeah.
we allow them to just give some context beforehand, like, this is a 34-year-old female presenting with chest issues or something of that sort, and then the clinician goes in, sees the patient, but DeepScribe already knows the context, which is great, and it works. And then once the clinician's done with that encounter, within 2 to 3x the length of the conversation, so if it's a 10-minute recording, it'll come back in about 20 to 30 minutes. It'll be inside their EHR. So they go back
Whoa.
to their office and then sign off, or if they're using some of the more modern EHRs, they can just pull it up on their phone and sign off on the note there. But that's the front end workflow. And then in the back end, you actually have different parts of the integration, pulling in patients, surfacing the schedule, constantly syncing back and forth. And then also from a pushing note standpoint, you have the note being pushed. We have speech to text in the background that runs on the transcript, runs on the recording, and then you have an AI that writes a draft, and then we
Wow.
actually have a team of like human contractors that are our versions of medical scribes.
Oh, no
That
way.
Yeah, we do, and they review the draft before it goes to the clinician, because a
So they
lot of
gotta
the
read
text
it
we're
like
working with,
that, huh? They gotta read it
they have
real.
to they have to read it like that. And a lot of
Wow.
times they don't actually have to do too much work. It's all
Hmm.
around making sure the content's there, making sure we didn't put something random in, or like the clinician didn't put the phone in a weird place, so there's no mistranscription or anything
Oh,
like that.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But the AI will help them write the note,
That's so
and
cool.
so we see them more as data labelers. But anyway, like
They're like the
they have a
scribe
pretty.
within the deep scribe.
Exactly, exactly. And then once that finishes, it goes back to the doctor, into the EHR, and it's all good then.
Wow. Does it also dictate, or because there's like multiple parts to a note,
Yeah,
in terms of like the assessment and plan at the end, where there's like a lot of that medical decision making that happens.
right.
Um, does the doc usually go in and edit that too, or does it kind of come up with a pre-draft?
Yeah, usually we like to. So the if it's in the conversation, it'll be in the note. So if a
Hmm.
clinician's like,
Oh, okay.
willing to just talk in front of their patient, that happens. But the reality is that most clinicians aren't comfortable doing that. So that's where the post visit summary comes in. So on the way, like once they're done with the patient, they'll quickly give a summary. And the nice thing about that is it's like talking to a human. So you don't actually have to visualize what you're saying and put in the punctuation and things like that, like you have to do
Yeah.
with Dragon. You just sort of talk to it. So you
Oh, that's
say,
so nice.
yeah, you say like, this patient was 34, by the way. They came in with this. My differential diagnosis is, and then you can pause, and then you can uh, recollect your thoughts and say things, and then DeepScribe will like structure it into an MDM or an assessment or a discussion that makes sense, treatment that makes sense. So that's kind of how I think most clinicians handle the assessment and plan.
Mm, that's super cool. Um, I'm actually not sure ab- about this. So I know that billing with notes has like changed recently.
Hmm.
Are you aware? I actually don't know the answer to this, but like, do you know how billing works with notes? Because I've heard that in the past, you kind of had to have like 10 points in the review systems, and like physical exam
Right.
had to have this kind of findings. But I think now there's a shift towards more so just medical decision making. Is that true or not?
Right.
Or have you guys like
Yeah,
anticipated that? And
it's true. I think at the end of the day, for DeepScribe, we leave it up to the end user, the clinician, to kind of decide how they want their notes to be based off of like how they'll be billed. So, the shift to
Okay.
value-based care, as you said, puts a lot of emphasis on the medical decision making. It puts emphasis onto the time that the physician spent with the patient, and the length of the HPI and things like that that used to be important are no longer as important from a billing standpoint for some clinicians, but then for other clinicians, it is important. So I think the main thing that we just have to do from a DeepScribe standpoint is support both of those workflows. So if a clinician decides to bill their notes under the new like value-based guidelines, then we support that. If a clinician uses the older guidelines, then we can support that too.
Wow. Um, how would you say DeepScribe has changed from like the first 50 docs that you worked with versus like now?
Yeah, scale is tough, man. I think in the beginning, as a startup, whether it's DeepScribe or anything else, your first 50 customers, or maybe even less than that, you will always know them like the back of your hands. So you'll know them by name, you'll know them by style, you'll know how much they're using your product. If they have any issue, you'll be able to get in front of it without them having to ask for it. So yes, you have a product, but you also know your customers really well, and like the founders are directly invested in making it an amazing experience. So the customers almost get this like supercharged version of the product. But at customer like number 600 that we're at right now, it's you can't, if you ask me to name all 600 docs on DeepScribe, I wouldn't be able to.
That's
Um,
all. You guys are at
and
600. That's congratulations.
Yeah, thank
Wow.
you. So it all becomes a problem of how do you scale that amazing customer experience that you had at the beginning? How do you scale that quality of the product and consistency that you had at the very beginning? How do you get in front of bugs? How do you get in front of potential impediments? So it all becomes a problem of process, bringing the right people on board onto your team that you trust to deliver that experience. So I would say that every single person on our team right now, I can trust that they'll make a decision with the same framework that I would have with that customer. And so that's how you honestly scale these customer experiences, is with the people that end up building tech or processes that allow us to scale. So that's what's really different about the product. I would say from a user experience, it's very similar. I mean, there's a lot of upgrades and complexities that we've had to add to support different types of docs. With a health system, you need an admin dashboard, you need different levels of authentication. You need certain like security de-identification measures in place. But at the end of the day, I think the experience has been the same, in which a clinician can just get rid of all their documentation by subscribing to DeepScribe.
Wow. Really? That's a bold and
It's a
ambitious
bold claim.
claim.
That's
They
why
could
we're
get rid of
here.
all
Yeah.
their documentation?
Yeah, that's why we're here. So obviously they have to review it for each patient, but the time savings we see is one in which, if a clinician is spending 5 minutes on their notes, or 10 minutes or 15 minutes, they see a good high percentage reduction in that documentation, and can get that time savings. And the more they get used to the workflow, the more they trust DeepScribe, they can start to almost predict like what it's going to get right and what may need
Oh,
editing. So
wow.
you have to review every
It's
note, but you know where to look, right? And so you
it's like
can, yeah,
symbiotic ML, human and
exactly,
ML learning? That's
exactly,
pretty cool,
exactly,
learning on both ends.
exactly. Yeah. And then we also have our, human loop that makes sure that any blatant corrections can get corrected before our clinicians actually look at it, right? So yeah, at the end of the day, I mean, we're pretty proud about the time savings that we can offer to clinicians.
Wow. The so if each note has got to get reviewed by a human in the loop, like that has to also scale too, right?
Exactly. I think that's been one of our biggest challenges, and continues to be as we scale. It's a different challenge at every segment. One thing that we're excited about is with our Series A investment, we received funding from Index Ventures, who also back Scale AI, And a lot of the challenges you see with us, Scale already saw. And
Oh,
Alex,
that's pretty
the
cool.
CEO of, yeah, Alex, the CEO of Scale, is an investor in DeepScribe as well. And so we kind of have this, like God tier view, for lack of a better word,
Yeah,
on our operations and how we're scaling.
that's so
And so a
cool.
lot of the problems they live through, we can, solve in advance, so they don't have to face them again. So that's the analogy I would make, and I think that's the reason we're optimistic that we can continue to just grow at the pace we've been growing, and scale this human loop operation.
That's very meta. And what I
Yeah.
mean by that is that it reminds me of because we were talking about DeepScribe and how it's built of like a component, like different models, different algorithms that kind of work together, and you kind of have like
Hmm.
the speech recognition, you have like the one that writes the note, and they kind of all come
Right.
together almost like parts of a car coming together. Um,
Hmm.
and then now that you're scaling it, it's almost like you're scaling something that is already built of many parts, and
Hmm.
you're kind of you're involving another startup that is good at that. You know what I mean? I don't know. It's like kind of
Yeah.
like I guess how I describe it is like, in our cell we have like proteins, and each protein does a certain thing, and then that comes up to
Hmm.
form the cell. And then the cell in our body, we have different kinds of cells, and they do different things, but they
Yeah.
come up to form organs. Organs form the human, and then humans form a society. It's almost kind of like,
Hmm.
you know, it's like DeepScribe interacting with Scale AI, interacting with Index. It's like a next level, higher order structure.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I was a little bit lost, to be honest, at the beginning of that analogy, but but it definitely makes sense towards the end. Yeah, I think it's sort of this like nice symbiotic relationship, where you build on each other and then work together to create something much bigger.
Yeah. And then, yeah, now you guys will change healthcare for humanity.
Yeah, that's the
Hopefully,
goal.
right?
So I think the documentation piece of DeepScribe is what we're working on right now, what we're heads down on, and I think we can make a fairly big impact. But one thing that a lot of folks don't know about DeepScribe is as we process every patient conversation, we can actually structure this data, right? And in order
Oh,
for a model to train on the data, you have to have a certain amount of structure. You need to know where the medication is. You need to know how the medication correlates with the side effect, how it correlates to a symptom. So you essentially have this, graph of what a patient's
yeah.
going through as they go through a conversation. And, with the ties we have to different EHR systems, um, we can supplement it with other information that's helpful. But at the end of the day, I think one big trend that we have the ability to push forward in healthcare is this idea of data-driven decision making. And I'm sure as a med
Yeah.
student, you've looked into medical errors and you've looked into how all that works. And I'm sure maybe you've had guests on the podcast that have talked about that. There's this massive opportunity where 5% of patients are being misdiagnosed as of like 2021, and you have medical errors being like one of the major leading causes of death. And sure, there are parts in which a nurse may give the patient the wrong medication, or you may see like a fumble in logistics. But then there's this bigger idea of clinicians making decisions based off of certain patient populations, or not having seen or having had the exposure in order to like make a certain decision in the favor of the patient, which is one major cause of misdiagnoses. So the goal for DeepScribe is one in which we can kind of empower these clinicians or any participant in the process, even the patient, with this kind of data to know like, hey, like these other patients came in with this kind of story, these kind of symptom progressions, and link them to the clinical outcomes so that on a generalized level, not just specifically focusing on like things like heart disease or like a specific thing, like we have data on a lot of different trends that are happening. We can kind of alert the physician, and it doesn't have to be we're making a diagnosis for a clinician. It can be as easy as, hey, I think you should really order an EKG for this patient
Yeah.
just to rule out any sort of cardiac illness. I know you think it's GERD, but I think you should really do that, right? And I think by
That's
doing
so
something like
cool.
that, that's where we turn from like a documentation tool into someone that's really trying to push healthcare forward.
Into something more like a Jarvis, right?
Exactly, a Jarvis for doctors.
Wow. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
That so it's kind of like, in addition to doing it, kind of like, would you say that your vision is also in, like kind of including these predictive models, perhaps even
Right.
like recommendation.
Yeah, exactly. I think at the end of the day, whether we build the models or if someone else builds the model on the data, I think we just want to be the ones to make data in healthcare a reality, because I think
Yeah.
right now you have a lot of these silos. You have these big companies trying to do this really hard, but in order to do that, you have to buy the data from someone, or you have to,
Mm,
pay the patients to get the data. You have to treat it like this big deal to record certain things, to get certain evaluations. You have to make partnerships with EHRs. A lot of these things just take time. And I feel like at the pace we're currently going, this whole idea of making medical decision making powered by recommender systems is not going to happen. So I think the only way to make it happen is to be able to control the inflow of data, control how you're labeling data, and then figure out how to do it at scale, which we've done kind of on the back end of DeepScribe. And you can just port over a lot of these learnings you have into trying to build recommender systems, or just enabling this like perceived future of healthcare. There are a lot of risks. There are a lot of ifs.
oh yeah.
Maybe the recommender may not work. Maybe we need some other form of data. But I think as long as we're trying and like kind of make it this norm, I think that will push healthcare forward to 3.0 or 4.0 or whatever the latest
Yeah.
point oh is nowadays.
I think it's really cool that uh, the what you guys are building is literally like closest to the patient, in the sense of you're literally listening to the patient and the doc,
Hmm.
and you have like that raw data that I feel like traditional, when people try and build these recommender or predictive like these kind of models, they use like their lab values or they use imaging, but they don't actually use like the words of the patient. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like it's cool. Like I don't know. I wonder if if like a patient is short of breath, like
Hmm.
you could probably hear that on the microphone, right? Or,
That too. That too. I think there's this whole other side that I didn't mention around like voice diagnostics, like
mm-hmm.
being able to decide certain things about a patient from just a voice sample. And there's been published research about how you can, for example, diagnose the top 10 mental health disorders through
Oh
a 30
yeah.
second voice sample with above
Wow.
90% accuracy, which is mind blowing.
That's
But
insane.
yeah, it is insane. But right now, in order to do that, you have to work with patients specifically, set up a study, collect their voice samples, link them to certain diagnoses. But at DeepScribe, like that kind of happens on a natural basis, right? Like we're not specifically doing that. We happen to have a bunch of voice samples of patients that have certain disorders and certain diagnoses. And you can start to like make these systems really good, get them out into production, maybe, release an over there update that starts to give physicians insights into their patient's health
Yeah.
as they're having a conversation with them. This patient has a
Yeah.
95% chance of having an anxiety disorder. It's not in the EHR's diagnosis. Like you should just, and you should, do your, mental status exam, or do something additional to just, verify that that's the case.
Yeah. And then you could probably even get almost like longitudinal samples of like, oh, here's like a not a thermometer, but yeah, like an emotional thermometer of how this patient is doing like over these different
Right.
visits.
Right.
You
Exactly.
have
Exactly.
yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So many crazy ideas. I think it's just about getting the data in place. And then once we get the
Hmm.
data in place, right, like there's, it could go so many different directions. And with the right amount of funding, you can make anything happen.
Yeah. I got to ask a elephant in the room question, and that's
Sure.
about one, patient privacy, like
Yeah.
because you are like using do patients have to consent to this beforehand? Do they know? Um and like, de-anonymizing data, like could you kind of speak about that?
Yeah,
Or sorry, not
for sure.
de-anonymizing, I guess anonymizing, sorry, not de-anonymizing,
Yeah.
but you know what I
We
mean.
definitely don't want to de-anonymize data. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So privacy has been really important to us from the very beginning. Just being having worked at Apple, having seen the debacle that Facebook went through, and then also being in healthcare, right? Being a tech company in healthcare, you don't want to repeat those same mistakes. And our philosophy has always been, don't hide anything from the patient. So in the very beginning, like we make sure that our clinicians always ask for consent, or try our best. I mean, you want to make sure that the patients know they're being recorded. They know what is happening to that recording after they leave the room. And then patients also have our email address and like a great way to contact us. and we're pretty responsive to the patients when they do contact us, and they could ask us to delete their data, delete any trace of the data they have on our system. They can notify us that they did not consent to being recorded. So and we can act accordingly. So it's kind of just building this bond with the patient, right? That builds trust. That's how we've handled it so far. I think, in terms of the future vision of building recommender systems, uh, technically right now, we we don't want to use the same data to do that. We need to make sure we get the right consent, the right
Yeah.
transparency, and like just
Yeah.
continue this process with the patient so that they know what's happening to their data.
Hmm.
We have the ability to de-identify it, but again, like de-identification from a technical standpoint will separate a patient's information from the information or from the actual relevant content. So you remove the social security number, the name, the address, the gender, the date of birth, and you just keep the information that's important. And from a technical standpoint, like that's technically sound. There are laws around that, and it works. But I think we want to just go a step beyond and be like, hey,
Yeah.
we're. It's not like we didn't de-identify the data without asking, and then it becomes ours. Like we still want to make sure we ask, we get their consent.
Hmm.
And this data is valuable. It's very private in a lot of cases. So yeah, I think that'll be a bigger and bigger problem. But hopefully, like we can learn from the big blunders that have happened in tech and social
Yeah.
media, and make sure that we get the right people in place to get in front of that before it happens.
Mm. How many years away from a recommender system do you think we are?
I think we're pretty close. Um, as long as the privacy piece is something that we can get. I mean, you have the technical change and you have the uh, I don't know if emotional is the right word, but you have this sort of philosophical, emotional, like perception type of change, right? Where patient has to be okay with their data being used like that. The clinician has to be okay with something coming in and like recommending them. So it's this behavioral piece. That's the right word, behavioral.
Hmm.
That we have to get right. I think from a technical standpoint, that's um, that's more than enough. Like what we have is more than enough to build something like that.
Do you mean behavioral as in like a zeitgeist, kind of like uh, as in like how people feel about having their
Right.
data being
Exactly.
used?
Exactly. The whole perception privacy that you brought up. This is a massive change in healthcare, right? So
Yeah.
with social media, I think there were a lot of mistakes done. The jury's still out on whether or not it was a W for social media at the end. I mean, you had
Yeah.
right, like in the last like couple of decades, you had all sorts of data that you have being used, and sure, like there are privacy policies and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, even if it was technically sound, the or even if a lot of cases, some cases were definitely not technically sound from a legal standpoint, but a lot of them were, but they still got bashed
Yeah.
because the public opinion is what really matters at the end of the day. So so yeah, we need to see that transformation in healthcare in order for us to even get a stab at medical errors and figure out these bigger problems. So yeah, I think the behavioral change is as important as the technical change.
Yeah. And I feel like medicine in general always lags behind, 10 to
Yeah,
20 years. For part of some of the reasons that we're talking about, of it's like more sensitive data. It's more difficult to access. Um,
right.
yeah. Oh, but so I think we've already kind of talked a little bit about this about recommender systems. But I was wondering, what's your vision for DeepScribe?
Yeah. I think recommender systems aside, right? The next couple of years, we want to make sure that we close the loop on scribing. We're a market leader, but I think honestly that bar is kind of low in terms of the physician count that gets us there.
Yeah.
So it's about just making sure that we scale as fast as we can this scribing system across the U.S. So making sure that every clinician out there has access to get rid of their documentation
Hmm.
challenges and can focus on the more important problems that they should be dealing with. But in the next, like, the 5-year vision, it's all around how do we use this data to drive positive change in healthcare. And right now we're sitting on a data set that's the largest in terms of just raw size, as well as pretty close to the top there in terms of number of patients that exist in it. Um, so we already have this massive data set. It's growing exponentially. There's a lot we could do with it, and that's kind of where the future vision kind of branches out, as
Yeah.
being the biggest data company, or even the first data company in healthcare. Have you heard about Google Care Studio by any chance?
No, what's that?
So it's Google's take on an EHR. So they basically are building this layer on top of the EHR that enables search. But if you're
Oh,
interested in the EHR innovation space, I would totally check them out.
okay, okay.
They're doing good work there, and it looks
Oh,
a heck of a lot better than Epic.
oh, that's good to hear. It's cool seeing these big companies enter the medical fray. Like, I don't
Yeah,
know if you saw today, Amazon bought One Medical.
that was insane. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like, oh my god, this is interesting, interesting space.
It's so awesome to see because I feel like we honestly got a little bit lucky because in 2017 when the name DeepScribe was coined, and then even in 2020 when we like first released the product, there just wasn't any hype in healthcare. Like
Yeah,
people weren't talking about it. There are no articles about burnout. But now if you search the word burnout on Google, there are hundreds of articles on it. It's a
yeah.
thing. People know about it. But they didn't know about it before. So I feel like now we're sort of seeing this massive acquisition landscape from these big tech companies, with Microsoft's acquisition of Nuance back last year. And then you also see this Amazon acquisition. I think Oracle recently acquired Cerner. You're
Oh
seeing
wow.
these tech companies get in the healthcare space, and it's great for startups like us because
Yeah.
spotlight is now on like healthcare innovation. So yeah, I couldn't have wished for any better. They say that like success has like a certain percentage of luck. That's our percentage of luck right there. Like just getting burnout and healthcare challenges to be mainstream.
Good timing. Yeah, good timing. I actually was at a lecture about burnout earlier today, and the doc was saying in the past 3 years alone, uh, more articles on burnout have been published than than all of the history of medicine. Like
Wow,
from 2019, like prior to 2019, all of the articles about burnout, that is actually less than the number of burnout articles published from 2019 to 2022, which is it's
that's
pretty nuts.
insane.
Yeah. Um, this is one of our closing questions. I was wondering, what advice would you give to, let's say to founders, like to people who want to enter this space, who are feeling entrepreneurial? You're a founder yourself. Like, what advice would you give to someone who wants to like enter this fray?
Yeah, specifically healthcare, I would say be scrappy and be naive. That's one thing that really helped us at the beginning. We're not doctors. I've never worked in healthcare. Neither did my two co-founders. And honestly, neither did until we got to 6, 7 people, no one really worked in healthcare. And so we came from a like purely tech background, which was great because we started to question every single thing about clinicians' workflow, about healthcare workflows, right? So we didn't take anything for granted, and we ended up building a solution and solving a problem that a lot of people with healthcare backgrounds were just not able to solve. So I would say that's the number one thing is just be naive, and then the scrappy part is around. It's almost like a second. It's almost like a brother to being naive, where in order to be naive, you have to hack together things that you believe clinicians or anyone in healthcare would like. You're not building this big refined product that takes years of development. You're building something in a couple of days. You're testing it. You're iterating fast. And I think that's what a lot of these digital health companies that are really taking off now have done from the early days. And that's what we did as well. That helped us get a lot of the early success.
Mm. I also want to ask some personal questions. If that's okay with
Sure.
you. Um, what brings you joy? These questions are actually inspired by a doc that he would ask these of his patients, and I like them a lot, so I stole them from him. But yeah, question number one is what brings you joy?
um, What brings me joy? I think one of the things that I really like doing is um, looking back on the journey, right, and seeing the current impact we're making. So, like seeing the number of patients we've seen, seeing the money we've raised, if that is a data point that people like to see, or just seeing like customers come in the door and be like, hey, unsolicited, this is the best thing that's ever happened. I'm now able to spend more time with my kids. I'm spending more time with my family. Um, a lot of that just joy, a lot of my joy just comes from just like zooming out and being like, hey, like today we have a team of 60 people. They're all working towards solving documentation, have some of the smartest engineers and just people in the world working on this problem with us. And then you have the impact we're making. So there's nothing that like brings me more joy. Even if I won the lottery tomorrow, like I don't think it would bring me such joy as just seeing the impact.
Yeah. Question number two is, what are your greatest fears? Or like, what is your greatest fear?
Yeah, I think the greatest fear that I have, and I always feel bad answering these questions because I feel like I come up with a much better answer after having 30 minutes to think about it. But I think as of now, point blank, greatest fear is probably around um, the this behavioral component in healthcare. And right now we've gotten like what we just chatted about. I think we've gotten lucky because it's been a priority for a lot of clinicians to adopt scribes. But when it comes to what's next, back in 2019 when we first were piloting our product, it was almost a taboo to go and say, hey, your recording is going to be processed by the cloud. A lot of health
Mm,
systems were like, can we do this on prem? Now you don't get that question that much because it's the norm. But can this behavioral change start to be the norm where people are okay with letting people train their models on the data as long as the privacy components are there, the controls are in place to keep the data unified? I think that's one big thing that we have to get out of our way in order to move healthcare forward even more. So yeah, I think point blank, that's probably my biggest fear.
hey, I think it's good you're here early. You're starting. You're like one of the vanguards. You're
Yeah.
kind of paving the way. Um, the last question is, what gives your life meaning?
Oh man, we got philosophical here.
Yeah.
What gives my life meaning? I feel like there are a bunch of ways to answer that question.
However you like to.
There's a cheap way I could answer this question and just say one word, and that's DeepScribe. But
That's funny. That.
um, honestly, honestly, having the power to make the impact that I'd like to make on something. So it doesn't exactly have to be healthcare. I would be lying if I said that my biggest happiness or my meaning to life is moving healthcare forward. It's really not. My meaning to life is being able to make an impact with
Mm,
tech that has previously been considered impossible or like people are clearly not working on. That still makes a massive difference on people's lives. So again, like I think DeepScribe is like a great platform, but if not DeepScribe, it would have been being able to use technical skills, bringing people together, empowering people with a mission to solve something else that like changes the world in a very positive way, and then being able to just like write your name on that, right? Like you did
yeah.
this,
Yeah.
and you're not working on some other problem. Like you're not spending your working days and your precious life hours um, doing something that you're not happy to do. There are a lot of jobs like that. There are a lot of projects like that that people work on. But just building something that gives you satisfaction and being lucky enough that I can have a livelihood doing it. I feel
Mm.
like I got very philosophical all of a sudden, but I
No,
would
that
say
was
that
great.
that's probably what gives my life meaning.
I was even thinking, we were talking earlier about like recommender systems, and maybe
Yeah,
the next step after Deep Scribe will be Deep Doc.
deep doc. I love
Yeah.
it. You
Deep
open your
medicine.
phone, you talk into it, and you get an instant diagnosis. That's
Yeah.
99% accurate.
It's like instead of a Jarvis helping out the doc, you'll just have a Jarvis who is the doctor.
Yeah, that'd be awesome if we can pull it off.
Yeah. That'd be pretty cool. Wow.
But that's the kind of
Any
crazy stuff you can do, right? Like as long as you have this platform, like you're in your own control. Of course, like public opinion, behavioral, like that's the problem. But like you can do whatever you want. Like if you want to make more money off of billion coding and moving upstream, downstream, and work on the problems that people have already solved, you can do that. Or you can just pursue something crazy like building recommender systems.
mm,
And like the team that we have would probably love to do that because it's just very novel. It's outside the box. So yeah, I think like back to the meaning of life question, it's just being able to do things like that and even have the opportunity. So super thankful for that.
Uh, and I feel like that question in particular, that recommender system, it's I don't want to say it's like not the holy grail of like the medicine and machine learning space, but like I think a lot of people like to think about that, and a lot
Yeah.
of docs are afraid of that, and
Hmm.
it's I don't know, it's like it's a question that a lot of people like to ponder, like, oh, are we gonna have
Yeah.
like a recommender system for medicine one day? No, 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 no.
Yeah. I'm curious from your standpoint as a med student,
Mhm.
what do you how do you guys think about something like that? Because obviously you still have this like I don't want to say naive because I want to give you credit, but you have this like you haven't been in healthcare for too long, as at least as long as like a clinician that's practicing.
Mhm.
So you don't have that like I'm already like burned in perspective. You have this like very like just optimistic probably perspective going in. I know you had to do step and stuff, so maybe not as optimistic as you'd like, but like still optimistic. So I'm curious, like what you think about the recommender system part of things and like medical errors, misdiagnoses, things like that.
And the what part? What was the second part you said? Oh, medical errors
Um,
and misdiagnoses.
Medical errors.
Yeah, actually, I appreciate you asking this question because it's actually one of the reasons why this podcast was started is because I feel like as med students, we don't really talk much about AI or kind of how technology is changing medicine. But I do think even in the process of studying for STEP, I realized that a lot of these things is just pattern recognition, or you kind of have this like vault of knowledge, and it's like, all right, it's
Yeah.
almost how like a key works. It's like on a traditional key, there's like a key, and then there's like different parts of the key, and then it pushes down, and if certain parts push on, like the lock
Hmm.
opens. And like answering your question is like that, where like there's just like certain parts where like if it open like you have to push certain parts of your memory
Yeah.
with it, and if it opens, like, all right, the answer is like vancomycin, or something silly
Hmm.
like that. um but I do think a lot of this, especially at this early stage in my career, um it's stuff that I don't think is like, it's not like there's some like deep like, oh, only humans can come up with a solution. No, it's like we have to learn this, and it's all, it's just a series of facts that you need. Like,
Yeah.
you're given a presentation, and it's like, depending on like what data you've been fed before, okay, this is your answer. So I think that I recommend it, like you could definitely train like an AI model or whatever. Like your DeepScribe could probably take step one and do really well. It could definitely pass for sure. Or
Yeah.
if you were to feed it like, like the all of the former questions, like if you were to feed it like UWorld and like first aid, whatever,
Hmm.
DeepScribe you could definitely build something that could take step, and like that would actually maybe be a fun little side project, to
Yeah. You
show
should
that
totally
like
do it.
we've reached like, oh yeah, like we've built a system that can pass medical boards.
Yeah.
Totally doable. But I think that, yeah, like in the future, um I think recommender systems, actually they probably should be a part of medicine, just because like it's hubris to think that any one person could like know, like,
Exactly.
hey, always have the right answer. And to have like, maybe like a little AI robot whispering over your shoulder, like, hey, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. um
Exactly.
yeah, so
Yeah. It's kind of like it's not even a recommendation as much as it is just surfacing data on something, right? Like if I was,
yeah, yeah.
I obviously have not gone through med school or am a doctor of any sorts, but if I imagine myself in like a clinician's shoes, I would be really scared to give a patient a diagnosis if I was even 99% sure instead of 100%
Mm-hmm.
sure, because I've read the stuff on medical errors. I've seen so many case studies. Like I don't want to be that type of clinician that makes mistakes, but like the reality is, if 5% of patients get misdiagnosed, every single physician out there is like making a mistake at some point in their
Oh, for
career, which is
sure.
like a scary thought of the patient. So just even giving them the data, right? Like that's what I would
Yeah.
love as a clinician, because now all of a sudden, like I'm making a decision. Sure, I can consult my colleagues, but I also have this like almanac in front of me of 200 similar patients that have had that same story, and like I can order this test that I probably wasn't going to order before, in hopes that like I can narrow down on certain like diagnoses that could have a massive impact on the patient.
Yeah, I think that's what this podcast is all about. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I'm glad to have you on here, and like I really look forward to seeing what you do with DeepScribe. I'm rooting for you. As someone who's formerly, I worked for a company called Scribe America. I was a scribe for them, and they paid me minimum
Nice.
wage, and it sucked.
I'm familiar. Yeah.
So I hope you can take them down, because they exploit the youth. They exploit young pre-meds. That's another hot take. But thanks so much for being a guest, Akilesh. So happy to have you on the MaML podcast, and thank you for what you do.
Yeah, absolutely, David. Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun chatting about this, and I'm sure like it was cool hearing your perspective, because you talk to a lot of folks in the health innovation space, and you probably have this like perspective that's been shaped by all your previous conversations. So it's great to hear that take, and I'm glad there are no red flags with what we're doing so far that you've introduced. So that makes me happy.
Oh no, you seem very mindful of them all, and the kind of the deep ethical questions. Yeah. Glad you're leading this.
Thanks, man.